Good morning and welcome back to our final lesson in our fall Bible study, Believe in Me, Jesus in the Gospel of John. And before we begin today, because I don't want to end with this, because we're ending with the themes and the applications of John, and so I want to start with just a quick share of what we'll be studying in the spring. So I will put that on so everyone can see it. So our spring study is Ezekiel. I'm calling it Fiery Throne and Dry Bones. And these are references to passages in Ezekiel. This is a prophetic book. And Ezekiel is set in the 6th century BC. So it's during the exilic period. And Ezekiel was actually one of the exiles who went from Jerusalem and was taken to Babylon. So this is a period that we've looked at somewhat because we've looked at the history of the kings, and we've looked at Daniel, and we've looked at Isaiah. And so he meshes in with all of those. And Ezekiel has these amazing visions, and he performs these strange, they're called prophetic sign acts, where he acts things out to explain what God has to say to the people. And so it's not a book that I think people study very often, but the way that Ezekiel sees his visions of the glory of God really tie back to Exodus, to the Mount Sinai scene, to the vision of the throne room of God that we get in Isaiah, to maybe even Elijah's fiery chariot, because Ezekiel sees a fiery chariot throne that the glory of God is on the move in the book of Ezekiel. And it draws on the history of Israel, and then it points forward to the teachings of Jesus. And Jesus draws on Ezekiel, and Revelation draws on Ezekiel. And in fact, since Revelation is our most requested study, Ezekiel will provide some of the foundation for what we understand in Revelation, because Revelation takes a lot of those visions and images and ideas and pulls them forward. And unless we know what's happening in Ezekiel, we don't understand what's happening in Revelation. So we're going to do all of that. Ezekiel makes these crucially important connections for the way that God will bring the new covenant as a fulfillment of the old covenant. And so we'll have 13 lessons over the spring semester, same schedule, same format, and I'm really excited to dig into that with you. And you can find more information at deannamunger.com/Ezekiel, which is the website that I'm showing right here. So questions on Ezekiel? It's a weird book, but it's going to be an exciting book. Yeah, I think it is challenging. One of the reasons it's a little challenging is that it's long. It's 48 chapters, and we're only going to have 13 lessons. So we're just going to take the, I think, the most important passages, the passages that are the heart of the covenant shifts, and that are most, referenced elsewhere, have the most connections to the rest of the scripture. So I think it'll be good. All right, well, today we are going to complete our study with Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection in John 19 through 20. So let's begin by reviewing last week's lesson when Jesus was teaching his disciples. And we remember that Jesus was teaching, we have 4 chapters of just instructional conversation that fall in between the scene of Jesus washing his disciples' feet and the scene of the betrayal in the garden, where we will start today. And so we have all of this teaching. So what did you find meaningful? We did John 15 and 16 on Jesus, the true vine. And what stood out to you from that?
I thought the contrast of, in the Old Testament, that Israel was the vine, but they weren't very good at it. They had bad grapes. But in the New Testament, in John, Jesus is the vine, the new Israel. I had never thought about that juxtaposition of those two.
Yeah. Okay. So Jesus, as it happens so many times, Jesus is the new, the redo. And sometimes scholars will say the recapitulation of everything that was before. And so what Israel was always supposed to be, the light to the nations, the representative of God, and they were so bad at, Jesus is in the new way as the new human, the new Adam. So, Jesus is the true vine. He can produce good fruit, which Israel never could. Okay, yes, yeah, great point. What else?
I was thinking about the vine or any kind of plant has to be pruned and possibly even die in order to come forward as a new, more flourishing version of itself.
Yeah, yeah. The pruning is part of what Jesus talks about here. Go ahead, Sharon. Did you have something?
Well, Jesus is the vine, we are the branches, and we're the ones that get the pruning.
Yes. Yeah.
Add on to it.
Yeah. So he talks about living branches that are abiding in Jesus are still being pruned, and so there's a difference between the branches that are pruned and the branches that are cut off and thrown away, right? And so we have this idea of the the abiding in Jesus, the living in Jesus, and what that does for us. It allows us to bear the good fruit that Jesus bears. We end up bearing it. It allows us to be pruned or taught, disciplined to grow in ways that are sometimes painful. We talked about that. And to abide in Him. What else? Anything else stand out to you? I have a few things. Um, Jesus talks about what does it mean to abide in me? It means to obey my command, and my command is what? Love one another. Yeah, that is the way that Jesus talks about living in Him, abiding in Him, is to love one another. And then Jesus proceeds to show what it means to love one another. What does He do to show what it means to love one another?
Be willing to die.
Willing to die. Yeah, we get everything from the lowly service of the foot washing to His path to the cross with the greatest sacrifice everywhere. This is what it means to love one another. And that is how we live in Jesus. And He also talks about us being God's friends, right? And we're friends because we know the Master's business, is how He talks about it. But that idea that we get to learn and participate in the purposes of God. Wow, the God of the universe, we get to participate with what God is doing on the earth. This is what it means to be Jesus' friends. We accomplish that by loving one another. And we are enabled by the helper, the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of truth, who leads us into all truth. And we talked a lot about the Holy Spirit. Anything else?
Through the life and death of Jesus, we are drawn more intimately to the Father. So He's not just this, grand concept, but He establishes a path so that we can be closer to Him. But His friends concept it's a different take on the relationship.
Yeah. We have, the loftiness of Almighty God is paired with the humility of a God that pursues us, a God that wants to be with us, a God that was a friend to Moses. And we aren't like, okay, well, don't really aspire to the Moses level exactly. And yet we get to be Jesus' friends. And so Jesus has brought that to all of us. Yeah, great points. Well, on to today's passage. So I had you read 18 through 20. I know it's a long reading, 3 chapters, because it's hard to skip anything in this section, but we will indeed only get to read part of it during class today. Did you have something else? Okay. So we'll start with John 18, and we're going to start in 1 through 11. And this is where the action resumes after that long section of Jesus' teaching. So will someone read those first 11 verses?
I'll take it.
Thank you.
When he had finished praying, Jesus left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley. On the other side, there was a garden, and he and his disciples went into it. Now Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place, because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas came to the garden, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "I am he," Jesus said. And Judas the traitor was standing there with them. When Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Again he asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they said. Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. If you are looking for me, then let these men go." This happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. "I have not lost one of those you gave me." Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Jesus commanded Peter, "Put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?"
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Okay. All right, so they go out, and at the end of the supper where Jesus washes the feet, he says they go out, and then a couple of times during that teaching and they go out, right? So where do they go? They go to this garden, and John does not name it Gethsemane like the synoptics mention, but John does let us know that this is a garden where Jesus often met with his disciples. So it seems the kind of teaching that we've just been immersed in those 4 chapters of teaching is teaching that Jesus was doing as part of his ministry. This is what he would do. He would teach in this way. And it's probably just that John has gathered those teachings into that flow, that long flow of those chapters. So verse 3, who all shows up?
A lot of people.
A lot of people.
Officials, the chief priests, Pharisees.
Okay. And Judas. So we have Judas. Soldiers. How many soldiers? It's a lot. Yours says a detachment. You can also translate this cohort. This is the word for a tenth of a legion. 600 men. 600 soldiers.
For one man.
This is a lot of soldiers, right? Plus the officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, and apparently they have their servants with them. And what else do they have with them? Weapons, torches, and weapons, right? So what is the emotional tenor of this scene? Like a mob, okay? Maybe more disciplined since they're soldiers, but what else? High tension. Tense, charged. This is a charged scene, isn't it? Now this is happening at night. Yeah. It says they have entered into the garden. So this is a garden that somehow has boundaries. And if the soldiers come in after them, they may be trapped in this area, and it is dangerous. If you have 600 soldiers to arrest someone, what are the possible outcomes? It can get ugly, can't it? Violence could easily break out here, right? So this is a scene that we might call a powder keg, right? This is an emotionally charged, dangerous scene. And why does it say that Jesus went to speak to them? This is verse 4. He knew all things that were coming upon him. Jesus, knowing all things, goes back. And Jesus asks whom they seek, and what does Jesus answer? I am. Yeah, you can cross out your he, right? We talked about this. This is one of those, the same as the others that we talked about, where the translators are providing the word he so that it makes a sentence in English. But in the Greek, it is ego eimi, and it corresponds to the Hebrew for I am, the words that give us the name of God, Yahweh, that powerful name. And so when Jesus answers, I am, how do they react?
And it's almost like they are very aware of who I am is.
Who I am. Okay, so do we think that a detachment of Roman soldiers are that impressed with the reference to the name of God? Just the idea of it.
Maybe the power with which she spoke.
Okay,
Something
the
in
power.
the
They
authority.
draw back and fall to the ground. Soldiers.
It sounds like there was some kind of supernatural thing.
It does sound like there's more power in what Jesus says than just a reference that Jews would get and other people would maybe not get, maybe not care about, right? It sounds like there's actual power here in Jesus' statement of his identity. I am. And they draw back and fall to the ground. Soldiers who were keyed up to arrest someone in a confrontation at night. So what power seems to be a part of this?
We don't know how many Pharisees and chief priests were there,
We do not.
but it's a large group.
It's a large group, even with Jesus. They're arresting one man, but he has the 11 disciples at least. And if some have speculated there were more disciples together at that time, he has that group is with him. And so this is not a small clash, and yet they're falling to the ground. This is the final of the 7 I ams of Jesus, right? Remember in John, we have 7 I am metaphors. I am the good shepherd. I am the gate for the sheep. I am the way and the truth and the life. I am, all of those. And we have 7 I ams. In addition, 7 where Jesus says, I am. Like, I tell you the truth, before Abraham was born, I am. And they pick up stones to stone him. And so there is power in this. And Jesus makes an impact, right, with this last claim to be I am the God of Israel as this passion sequence begins. And it's not a military show of power, is it? What happens when swords come into the mix? Yeah. And in all the other gospels, it's someone. But John's like, and it was Peter who did it, and it was Malchus whose ear. John gives us the names, whereas the other gospels do not.
But what I also noticed in here is that John did not say where Jesus put the ear back on.
Right.
Where the other gospels
The other
do
gospels
say that he put the ear back on the person.
Oh, you're right. I didn't even notice
Well, where's that?
that it didn't say that he healed him.
He leaves out what he doesn't think is important.
Yes, yeah. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen or that he doesn't care that it happened. He just can only put in so much, I mean, there's been a lot in here, right? So, yeah, he's going to name names.
Where it goes.
Yeah, John is naming names. So, yes. So, what is Jesus' other concern in this highly charged scene? Verse 8.
He's concerned for the people with him.
The people
that
with
they're
him.
not harmed.
Everybody
else's safety.
Yes, yeah. So let these go their way. And when we sort of back it up and go, oh, this would have been a dangerous scene. This could have easily exploded into violence. The disciples could be in real danger of being mobbed, beaten, or killed as Jesus is being arrested for what is a very dangerous accusation of blasphemy and or insurrection. Right? And so the people with him would be implicated by by association. And so Jesus is knowing what's about to happen, showing the power of his word as the word, and ensuring that what happens next goes the way God has planned and that none of the disciples are harmed. Other thoughts on this passage?
That very last part of that, I have not lost one of those you gave me.
Mm-hmm.
It makes me pause and wonder about Judas. Was Judas one that God gave to him?
There's other passages where it says accept Judas, or, so, but I think, we could take that either way, right? Because Jesus did choose Judas, and yet he knows that this is going to happen.
So do you think when Jesus chose Judas, that Judas was, okay, a good guy, that he really didn't intend at that time to betray Jesus? And then along the way, you know how we lose our way sometimes?
Yeah.
That's a thought.
I think, it's so easy to think of people as black and white, and it's so seldom the accurate, and so to just think of Judas as a pure villain all along, I think is probably too simple for reality.
All of
Yeah.
these men
Yeah.
were just men.
Yeah.
They were from all walks of life, like we are. They had their strong points and weak points, their flaws that, tripped them up along the way. But they still had faith at some point.
Yeah.
So I think that they were just normal guys and gals.
And isn't it interesting that God didn't choose superheroes to be Jesus' friends and companions, and to bring the church into being? God chose regular people with flaws, And so when our flaws are resting heavy on us, then we know, like, this is the kind of people God chooses, because what other people are there to choose from? Right. This is who God chooses, even me. Yeah. Well, we're going to skip ahead over the scene with Antipas and then Caiaphas. There's a brief audience with each of them, but there's no real trial, because remember that Jesus has been, symbolically, I guess, on trial with the Jewish authorities since chapter 5, when the Jews began to persecute, or even we might say prosecute, him. And the main trial content in John is before Pilate. So would someone who would read John 8, I was going to say a little longer passage, but it's not that long, 18:28 through 40, if someone would read that.
Then the Jews led Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanliness, the Jews did not enter the palace. They wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked, "What charges are you bringing against this man?" "If he were not a criminal," they replied, "we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." "But we have no right to execute anyone," the Jews objected. This happened so that the words of Jesus had spoken, indicating the kind of death he was going to die, would be fulfilled. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Is that your own idea?" Jesus asked, "or did others talk to you about it?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "It was your people and your chief priests who handed you over to me. What is it you have done?" Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jews. But now my kingdom is from another place." "You are a king then," said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You are right in saying I am a king. In fact, for this reason I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." Is that far enough?
Through 40?
40. What is truth? Pilate asked. With this, he went out again to
I'm
the
listening to Ladies Bible Class.
find no basis
Ladies Bible Class.
for a charge against him. But it is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of Passover. Do you want me to release the king of the Jews? They shouted back. No, not him. Give us Barabbas. Now Barabbas had taken part in a rebellion.
Okay.
Can we go back just a second?
Yeah, go ahead.
Who was Annas? I mean, if Caiaphas was the high priest, who was Annas?
So Annas is the father-in-law of Caiaphas, is what's mentioned here.
Why would they have taken him to Annas?
Why would they have taken? Okay, so this is a little bit of a tangent. During this period, the high priesthood was a bit of a dynasty. And so there are some sources that even talk about Annas and Caiaphas being high priests at the same time, which is, there's only ever supposed to be one. And it's supposed to be a lifetime appointment.
I remember reading about that.
Okay, and so why would Annas have been the high priest before but still be alive now? And so there's some power play and some politics going on with the Sadducees and like sort of the high priestly dynasty and the Romans.
Maybe he was a mentor.
It does bear some responsibility to, some resemblance to some of the historical, politics within the Catholic papacy. Yeah, people do things that are not the way things are supposed to be. And that's how it was going with Annas and Caiaphas. And we see the way that their interest in keeping power affected their assessment of Jesus here.
I'm amused at the irony that they wouldn't go into the house because then they'd be unclean. But they're doing this monstrous act that has filth all over it.
Yes, yeah, it does. I think that's intentional, don't y'all? I think
it shows their hypocrisy.
Yes, like the adherence. This is the sort of thing that Jesus talks about a lot in like Luke. It's not something that comes up a lot in John, but John hasn't missed it, right? We see the adherence to the letter of the law while attempting to, kill an innocent man. And let's talk a little bit more about that too. Okay, we'll get there actually. I want to go in order. What's going on in this? Let's look at 29 through 32. What's going on in this initial conversation between Pilate and the Jewish officials?
He wants them to justify what they're doing, and they can't really, and he doesn't like it. And he's just like seemingly frustrated with it.
Right?
Yeah.
It's as though neither one really wants to take full responsibility for this
Okay.
action. So they keep trying to shift the blame one to the other as to who's going to come down with the actual verdict.
Okay, I think that's exactly what's going. So Pilate doesn't want to get involved in what he's correctly understanding mostly as is an internal religious matter, right? And they say they aren't permitted to put him to death. What is that about? Hierarchy and power. Yeah, some scholars say that according to Roman law, they must not be allowed the death penalty. But if that's the case, wouldn't Pilate know that? And if we look down in the next chapter in verse 7, he further suggests you take him and crucify him. And so it doesn't quite fit with the text that's here. And also, they didn't seem worried about it the times they tried to stone him. Right? Go ahead, Sharon.
Well, I think Pilate does understand exactly that. That's why
that they aren't okay. Well, some scholars think that they aren't actually legally allowed to execute, and some scholars disagree with that.
The Pharisees, the Jews.
That the Jews weren't
Were
legal,
not.
that they were legally allowed to execute. You notice they execute Stephen in Acts. Paul is putting people to death repeatedly before so Stephen in Acts 7 and Paul before his vision in Acts 9. And there doesn't seem to be any fallout from that. It seems that they execute people just fine. Now, that doesn't mean it was strictly legal. They might have been doing it and just not, not getting in trouble for it somehow, right?
Who's doing
There's
all the stoning?
who's doing all the stoning. Okay, so
That was a common death punishment.
right, and they pick up stones to stone him multiple times. They
Right.
try.
So
Right. So is it really that they're not allowed to execute anyone? Some scholars think that while by Roman law they did execute people, they themselves, the Jewish leaders, didn't want to be responsible for it.
They didn't want to be the one to throw the first stone.
They didn't want to do the stoning, right? They didn't think they had quite enough to make it technically legal by the Mosaic law, which fits into Linda's point, doesn't it? Where they want to follow the letter of the law, but still do the bad thing that they want to do. Just find a way to get it done, even though they don't, maybe they don't think it's justifiable. Or maybe they want to be able to blame the Romans if some of the Jews who believe in Jesus complain. Maybe they want the public spectacle and the meaning of crucifixion more than they want stoning. Because what does this mean in verse 32? Signifying by what death he was about to die.
Are they possibly saying that the crime is like calling himself the king of the Jews because that would be kind of like a thing that they're thinking the Romans would care about? Like, hey, he's kind of pronouncing himself king over here when
Right.
really you Romans are in charge. Like this is like almost like a political statement.
Yes,
so
they
like,
have made it a charge of like insurrection.
Like insurrection, yeah.
Mhm.
I never really thought about that. I always just thought they were like personally offended that he's the king of the Jews. Like, but that may have been their way of getting the Romans.
Yeah.
interested.
Well, it is interesting because when Pilate asks what's the charge against him, what do they say?
What? Did they even say anything?
In the conversation that John records, they just say, well, if he weren't a criminal, then we wouldn't have brought him. They don't say the crime. And yet it is implied by the conversation that Pilate has when he goes back in. What's the charge that Pilate asks him about? Are you the king of the Jews? This is what Jesus is being accused of, is being a king, right? And Pilate repeats the question and that idea and the word king almost a weird amount. Have you noticed the repetition in this section? Why? Why is John telling us king, 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 king?
Because he is the king.
Because he is the king, right? The whole question that Pilate keeps addressing, is Jesus a king? And so there's what's going on in the scene, and there's what we bring as the reader, right? This is the question that is put to the reader, and indeed to the entire world. Is Jesus the king? And Jesus asserts his kingship is from above. He is king, but his kingdom is not of this world. And what is Pilate's response?
You are.
Well, it's a question still there, right?
what verse are you in?
Well, in 37, it says, you are a king then.
Then, right? Yeah, like John has him say it in a statement, but he's still asking Jesus to confirm it. And Jesus says, well, everyone who is of the truth will hear my voice. What does Pilate say? What is truth, right? This is just a question of, why do you think Pilate asked that?
Is he asking like what is truth, or is he asking what is the truth about whether or not you are saying you're a king? Like, is he just
Right.
confused about are you saying that you
they're all
are
confused.
or not?
Right,
Or is
right.
it kind of more philosophical?
Is it more philosophical? I think it's maybe both, or left ambiguous purposefully. Because again, we have that view of the reader. And so what's implied to the reader, the reality that the reader is invited to understand, what is truth? Truth is Jesus' kingship. That is the foundational reality from which everything else flows. So he is the creator. He is the word by which all things are made. And without him, nothing was made that has been made. And so whatever philosophy you're going to bring into the question, Jesus is at the heart of reality. And so I think that is sort of, John is doing two things, right? He's giving us the narrative, but he's inviting us to see Jesus is king. Jesus is the source of truth. Why do they say, so what does it mean? Let's go back. What does it mean signifying by what death he was about to die?
The crucifixion.
Crucifixion, right? Not stoning.
Right.
Why crucifixion?
That is the worst death
Okay.
that can happen to a person during this time.
Yeah, it is a terrible death, and it's a death that the Romans use
So
as
public.
it's public, it's a deterrent, it is a punishment for insurrection.
Prolonged.
It's prolonged. Yes, it
It's
is.
a torture.
It
nonetheless
is.
as
It
well,
is.
So it's a long, agonizing death.
It also fulfills what Jesus has been. Go ahead, Mary, were you going to say?
That's what I was going to say, it fulfills prophecy.
What Jesus has been saying all along, as Moses in chapter 3, when he's talking with Nicodemus, as Moses lifted up the certain serpent in the wilderness, so the Son of Man must be lifted up. In John 12, and if I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all men to myself. And so this lifting up is what Jesus has been saying will happen. And so this interaction where the Jews are pushing this off on the Romans is what creates the situation that leads to a crucifixion rather than a stoning.
And it's sort of interesting, when he said he'll be lifted up, the disciples are thinking he's going to be lifted to a kingship, and we're right there to help him.
Yes, yeah.
And so there's this other meaning to lift it up.
Yes. Well, because this is the nature of Jesus' kingship, right? It is a kingship where he is elevated to kingship on a cross. This paradox is part of the entire plan of salvation and the message of who God is revealed to be, right? God is the glory of God is the crucifixion, and the crucifixion tells us of the humility and the self-giving love of God.
And in reflecting back, how often does God use a political struggle for power to make his own plan come true? Think back to history so many times. And it's as if God's working through the politics.
I think he still is today.
You think back through all of history.
Well, we certainly have, this is the nature of the what the Hebrew Bible calls the former prophets, Joshua, Judges, First and Second Kings, where the prophets come back and tell the history of Israel. And the history of Israel is it's already in the annals of the kings of Judah and the annals of the kings of Israel, and they refer to it all the time. So we know it's already there. That's written. We don't have it, but for them, it's written. But the prophetic voice comes back and says, here's how God views this. Here's what God is doing in this. And so the action of God through history is part of the main message of the Hebrew scriptures that has led to this moment. Yeah. Okay, let's read 19, 1 through 22. That one actually is a little longer. Sharon, would you read that? Thank you.
Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in purple robe and went up to him again and again, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they struck him in the face. Once more Pilate came out and said to the Jews, "Look, I am bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him." When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." As soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, "Crucify, crucify!" But Pilate answered, "You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him." The Jews insisted, "We have a law, and according to that law, he must die, because he claimed to be the Son of God." When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid, and he went back inside the palace. "Where do you come from?" he asked Jesus. But Jesus gave him no answer. "Do you refuse to speak to me?" Pilate said. "Don't you realize I have the power either to free you or to crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jews kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat at the place known as the stone pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. It was the day of preparation of Passover week, about the 6th hour. "Here is your king," Pilate said to the Jews. But they shouted, take him away, crucify him." "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate asked. "We have no king but Caesar." The chief priests answered. Finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. So the soldiers took charge of Jesus, carrying his own cross. He went out to a place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. Here they crucified him, and with him 2 others, one on each side, and Jesus in the middle. Pilate had a notice prepared and fastened to the cross, and it read, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews." Many of the Jews read the sign, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and the sign was written in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. The chief priests of the Jews protested to Pilate, "Do not write the King of the Jews, but that this man claimed to be King of the Jews." Pilate answered, "What I have written, I have written."
Okay, thank you. All right. So, looking back at verse 1, what is the scene like?
They're torturing him,
Yeah.
embarrassing him,
Yeah.
derision.
Yeah, derision, torture, humiliation. It's the hatred and abuse that Jesus told his disciples to expect. And what's the dramatic irony in this scene?
Well, isn't it the Roman soldiers are doing this, but they're not really, they don't care. Like they're not really, they don't have their heart in it necessarily. They're just doing what they're told. And Pilate seems like he's just doing it to appease.
Yeah,
I'm hoping that this will be enough to just like appease them, and
yeah.
Jesus will actually get let off.
But they are willing.
Oh, well, like,
right?
yeah,
You know?
he's willing. Like, but I don't think they're
Yeah,
necessarily doing it
you're
out of
right.
any animosity toward Jesus on their own part necessarily. As these Roman soldiers, it's just their job.
Or animosity towards Jews as a whole, maybe, or just animosity. You know, the cruelty comes out, right? This is crueler than you would expect from someone just doing their job, right?
This is more of a mob mentality.
Yeah, maybe
Where-
the mob mentality.
Where things get out of hand because no one person is taking responsibility for it, so it's the responsibility is diffused among all these individuals. So
And the behavior is only worse
it's
instead of
kind
better.
it's
Yeah.
like a scrum or something almost. They're getting into it and they're getting a fever pitch going and they're doing things they might not ordinarily do.
Yeah. And yet the
because of
reader,
environment.
right, the way that they choose to torment Jesus, the reader knows Jesus deserves a real crown. Jesus deserves a real robe, a real throne. He should be sitting on the throne of judgment and will indeed after ascension sit on the throne of judgment. And so everything that happens, Jesus is we as the reader know that Jesus' real kingship is on display. Why? Because he is choosing this experience, terrible experience, out of love for his friends. This is exactly as he told them in chapter 15, expect hatred, expect abuse, but that's how they're going to treat me, and I do what I do out of love for you. What else? Anything else really strike you in that?
Well, they brought him out to show them what had been done, almost like though they weren't really participating in.
Yeah, the Jews,
that.
right. He's under the custody of the soldiers.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I do think you're right that Pilate thinks like, well, maybe this level of like humiliation will appease them.
Yeah.
Yeah. How is Pilate feeling by verse 8?
It says he's afraid. He is very afraid.
He's afraid. What does your translation say? Very afraid?
No, I put that
More
in there.
afraid than ever.
More afraid than ever. Okay.
That seems very
Mine
afraid.
says he was even more afraid, which is
Yes.
interesting because Pilate's fear has not previously been mentioned in this passage, and now he's even more afraid. But it hadn't said he was afraid before, although maybe we were supposed to infer it when he says, "What is truth?" There's a sense of unease there. But now he's even more afraid. What would have made him so fearful? Go ahead.
What's the gospel where it talks about his wife having those dreams?
Oh,
It's not mentioned in here, but
I think that is Luke, but I'm not sure.
because she was having dreams
Right.
and warning him,
Don't be a part of
be a
it.
part of it.
Yeah, which John does not cover. This is a very tightly written scene. It is spare. John handles this with maximum impact and minimum words here. Yeah. What would have made him so fearful? So we have that kind of in the back of our minds from another gospel, but even here, what do you think? What was the trigger?
So I think that Pilate is beginning to believe that Jesus really is the Savior, and I get that.
Where do you see that?
Well, because of the fear, and he keeps going back to talk to him and asking him, where are you, trying to confirm everything these guys out here are saying, and then like what Lee brought up is the dreams and his wife and all of this stuff coming to him in his brain. I mean, I know when my brain talks to me. I can't imagine that didn't happen.
Yeah.
To him.
Well, okay, so when your brain talks to you, you have a conscience that is trained by the Holy Spirit. Pilate, I'm thinking not, right?
Right.
And so he may not be as sensitive to the truth, and yet even Pilate here there's something.
Does it seem he's
There-
coming around?
He thinks there's something. I don't know if he's coming around because he does agree to it, and we'll talk about why he agrees to it in a second.
He feels like he's forced to agree with them.
Okay, I do
He's
think
caught
so.
a little of this.
He is caught. So
He's caught in
what
it.
the most, what's a super dangerous situation for law enforcement to respond to? Domestic violence,
Yes.
right? You
Yes.
get inside of an internal fight, and I think he has the sense that he is inside an internal fight. And the Jewish leaders seem particularly rabid with their "take him away, crucify, right? The Jews won't take him. They want him to be responsible, right? Also, they've been saying he claims to be a king. He claims to be a king. Now they say he claims to be the Son of God. And in a Roman worldview, that has a different meaning than in a Hebrew worldview, but it's still something not to be messed with. And so I think that is part of what really kicks off Pilate's fear. I don't think he understands who Jesus is, but I think he senses something in the interaction, and this idea that Jesus could be a son of the gods is probably how he would conceive of that, is frightening. Yeah, go ahead.
Is he possibly also thinking that maybe there's the people might rise up because is he wondering why? Because I'm sure he's seen really bad people, and then there's this guy Jesus, and this is the best you got. Is he said something? And he's not even
like the charges don't make sense. The interaction with Jesus doesn't fit with the criminals that he would normally. Yes,
he's there's more to the story. This guy's claiming this. Who else believes that he is
right?
And the Jews, and what could happen if I
and mob violence is a problem that he is definitely supposed to prevent, and he's in trouble if he doesn't. Right? What else stops him? What did they say that means that backs him into a corner?
Was it that he claimed to be the Son of God?
Yeah. Well, look down in verse 12. Okay. Pilate is still making efforts to release him, and then what?
No friend of Caesar to let him go.
Okay, no friend of Caesar. Friend of Caesar is actually a technical term. This is a term for a privileged status that was awarded by the emperor. And there's historical evidence that Pilate may have enjoyed this status because of his association with a highly anti-Semitic Roman official called Aelius Sejanus. And for some years, it had been very advantageous to associate it with this Aelius Sejanus, and then recently Aelius Sejanus lost his favorite status. So Pilate's hanging out on a limb, right? He is vulnerable. He could lose his friend of Caesar status, and he does not want that to happen. And so his protection of his power, once again, that's the theme that runs through, right? His protection of his power causes him to be backed into a corner and say, okay, I'll just do what you want to do. And what is the Jews' final cry in verse 15? Crucify.
Away with him. Okay. Away
ahead,
with
Shirley.
him. Away with him. Away with him. Crucify him.
Shall I crucify your king? What do they say? We have no king but Caesar. This is chilling. Why is it? Why, Lee? You notice.
They have now backed him completely into a corner and threatened him essentially that they're going to go against him if he doesn't do what they want.
So that's his fear. That's
right.
He's
right.
very fear.
But he's ironic in his statement about their king, though. That's almost his last
stab. Yeah, he keeps on the king thing, which I think maybe his sort of he may be mystified. He may think it's a bizarre charge, but John is using it to bring the kingship of Jesus to the forefront. Meanwhile, the entire story of the Hebrew scriptures, who was the king of Israel, the true king of Israel? God, Yahweh.
Completely with the state rather than their religion.
They have denied God, the king of Israel, which is what Jesus always said this whole time. If you deny me, you're denying the Father. They're saying, no, we're with the Father. We don't know who you are. And if you don't know who I am, you don't know the Father. Here it is. They don't know the Father. They have denied their king, who was always to be Yahweh, the king of Israel, and turn to the king of the evil Roman state.
It seems that on both sides, Pilate and the Jews, they are just doing whatever is serves their purpose at the time.
Expedient.
They'd be going back and forth, wishy-washy. And, they are not, they change their opinion from one minute to the next. It reminds me of current day politicians that say one thing and then they turn around and the next thing you know, they change their whole
Yeah.
policy.
I don't even think we have to put the word current day in there. That's just,
It-
that's politicians, or maybe that's just people. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like a basic weakness of character on both sides, that they just can't, stick with any one thing. They're just
Yeah.
swept by the winds of
Right.
public opinion.
Right,
and
which is, the unstable man who is tossed to and fro by what is that passage in James? Y'all know what I'm quoting poorly. Yeah, exactly. And Pilate does one more thing to stick it to the Jews. How does he get the last word? With his label, yes. He has this sign, here is the King of the Jews. And Pilate may only do it out of fear, maybe to minimize his own culpability. He may do it out of spite towards these Jewish leaders that have backed him into a corner. But the reader knows the truth. He is on the cross, and yet here is the King of the Jews, the God and King of the universe, sacrificing himself.
He's sort of summing up the crime that the cross is supposed to take care of.
That the cross is supposed to be the punishment for the crime, but in reality, it is the point of lifting up. This is Jesus' glory. He is revealing the true nature of God in his crucifixion, and it sums it both up.
Was it common to tack a sign on the crucifixion with the crime? So, for example, the other two criminals.
I have read that. I think so, but I can't remember for sure. I don't want to tell you for sure, but I think so.
Everyone knows why they're being.
Right. If you want it as a deterrent, then you want to say the crime. I think so. I can't remember for sure.
It's written in 3 languages.
3 languages.
Exactly.
Yes. Yeah. It's meant for the Jews to read it, right? You don't add Hebrew to something that's just for the general public. You add that for the Jews, right? So, or it may have been Aramaic. Sometimes in these, the Greek will say the word Hebrew, but what they mean Aramaic. It's the language of the Hebrews at that time. So, yeah. Okay, so we have done that. We have in 23 through 30, we have a series of 3 vignettes, or these mini scenes that make up Jesus' crucifixion. There's the 4 Roman soldiers, Jesus' family, and then the final death. So let's read that together. Then the soldiers, when they had crucified Jesus, took his outer garments and made 4 parts, a part to every soldier, and also the tunic. Now the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece. So they said to one another, let's not tear it, but cast lots for it to decide whose it shall be. And this was to fulfill scripture. They divided my outer garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. Passage from Psalms. Therefore the soldiers did these things. But standing by the cross of Jesus were his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, who's probably a separate person from the mother's sister. It's hard to tell from the way those commas are. And Mary Magdalene. And this is the first mention of Mary Magdalene in this gospel. When Jesus then saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, woman, behold your son. And he said to the disciple, behold your mother. And from that hour, the disciple took her into his own household. And after this, Jesus, knowing all things already had been accomplished, to fulfill scripture, said, I am thirsty. And a jar full of sour wine was standing there. So they put a sponge full of the sour wine upon a branch of hyssop and brought it up to his mouth. And therefore, when Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, it is finished. He bowed his head and gave up his spirit. 23 to 24, what's happening here?
He's on the cross and his family is surrounding him.
Yeah, okay, that is starting in 25, yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Cast lots. Now, and John tells us this fulfills prophecy. Why does this matter enough for John to talk about it? John, we've talked about this is not giving us a bunch of extraneous information.
It's to fulfill Psalms 22:18.
Okay, he's fulfilling, but why do we care about them fulfilling prophecy about those clothes?
Oh, it says it's the most valuable piece of clothing.
That's why they cast
That's
lots.
what they cast lots.
Yeah.
This fulfilled the prophecy in Psalms 22:18.
So what are Jesus' possessions? What possessions does
His
he
clothes.
have? This is it.
And
This
his
is
sandals.
it.
They don't say anything
Yeah.
about his sandals, but I'm assuming they were included.
I think so, because they divide up in parts, everybody gets a portion, it may not,
That's, yeah, basically he was a homeless person.
everything he has is here. It's all gone. In this opening little bit, Jesus has let go of all of his possessions. And then in 25 through 27, what happens there? He's surrounded by these women, right? These, according to Luke, these women have been financially supporting him. They're there.
But he instructs John to take care of his mother.
John takes care of his mother. And so he has let go of his family. He has distributed his responsibilities of this world. Go ahead.
That's a very earthly act, though, to provide for your family.
Yeah.
For your mother.
Yeah, earthly in the sense of it is needed on this earth, but also full of love. Yeah. So there's a sense of like, he's let go of his possessions. He has let go of his family. And in verse 28, what does it say Jesus knew?
It's finished.
Yeah, all things. All things had been accomplished. We opened the passion, this whole scene from the arrest on at chapter 18. Jesus knew all things that were coming, and now here he knows all things that have come. And because of that, he accomplishes scripture by being given vinegar to drink. And how does he die? He gives up his spirit, right? John 10, 17 and 18, for this reason the Father loves me, because I lay down my life so that I may take it up again. No one has taken it away from me, but I lay it down on my own initiative. I have authority to lay it down, and I have authority to take it up again, and this commandment I received from my Father. And so in these three mini scenes, Jesus has given up his possessions, given over his loved ones to one another, and now given up his life itself. And yet he remains in control where he is by choice. It is his gracious choice to give up everything, even to his life, for the salvation of mankind. Well, we are really running out of time, and I don't know. How do you all feel about going over a couple more minutes? Keep going or wrap it up? Which one was that? Keep going. Okay. All right.
About 7 minutes.
What's that?
We've got 7
We've got 7 minutes.
minutes. 7
Okay.
to 10 minutes.
Well, I will just highlight a couple of things. Who shows up in 38 and 39? But our old friend Nicodemus, right? Okay. Joseph of Arimathea. We haven't met in this gospel, but he is mentioned in all 4 gospels, and he is described as a member of the Jewish ruling council, which is also how Nicodemus is described in verse 3. So we have these 2 members of the Jewish ruling council, and people who have been secret disciples for Jesus for fear of the Jews. And what are we learning? People who had been too afraid to follow Jesus openly have now made their choice. Nicodemus has chosen Jesus in the end. So this question has been hanging over John since chapter 3, and Nicodemus has been popping up going like, well, shouldn't we listen to him first instead of just condemning him right away? But here we see finally Nicodemus has made his choice, right? The reader is invited to do as Nicodemus has done and finally decide to follow Jesus truly and all the way. And we get the scene in 23 through 10 where the disciples are racing to the empty tomb and one runs faster than the other. We get so many details that we hadn't gotten in so many other sections. And I think it's to give us a sense of the eyewitness character of this crucial moment, the resurrection, right? John brought us to the final scene. That scene changes everything. And he wants us to understand that this is reliable eyewitness testimony. And Mary Magdalene is the one person to whom Jesus actually appears at the empty tomb. So John gives us these important roles of women, right? We saw that great confession by Martha. We have the mission to go and tell the news of the resurrection. The first person charged to do such is Mary Magdalene, by Jesus himself at the tomb. And John ends with his own testimony in 21, 24 through 25. This is the disciple who is testifying to these things and wrote these things, and we know that his testimony is true. And it says if we told it all, you couldn't even contain the books that would be written. We wish he had told just a little more sometimes. But yes, he says, I have just told the bare facts of the story that changes our lives, right? So tell me about the Gospel of John. What have been some significant themes? What has meant the most or been an application you will take away?
One thing I enjoyed about it was it seems like a scholarliness or almost a poetic element to it because of the themes that he has, the light and dark, the sight and the blindness, the king, just in today, the repetition, the reinforcement of those.
Yeah, definitely. Poetic, I think, is a good
makes
word.
it stick with you more.
Yes, yeah.
It's like less of a biography and more of a theology book.
Yeah, I think it is. I think that's right. He opens with that theological prologue. We see Jesus as the Word from the beginning. We see the word of power that knocks the soldiers back in the end. And he just teaches so much. And his teaching, we notice, is not focused on moral instruction in John. That's been done, you know. Instead, we get focused on the identity of Jesus and the relationship of God the Son and God the Father, and how what it means to be from God, and what it means to abide in Jesus, and what it means to serve one another. And that is the focus of Jesus' words in the gospel, I think.
Those I ams and the divinity of Jesus all.
Yes, yeah, those I ams, the Yahweh, the great I am of God, everlasting and almighty Jesus is the word and the divine I am in John, and it really shows. Yeah. How about a focus on testimony? Right, John's testimony, that he talks about the testimony of so many people, from John the Baptist to every true disciple of Jesus has a testimony of Jesus. Even the man born blind convinces, he becomes convinced of his love of Jesus and his willingness to worship Jesus by giving his testimony. So that's something we can take away for us, is the power of telling our testimony, just as John had. And Jesus testifies about himself, and that is kind of the heart of the gospel. And then glory. The glory of Jesus is the glory of the Father, is the glory of Jesus, and they glorify one another. And that glory, the pinnacle moment of it is on the cross, that revelation of the nature of God, who sacrifices, right? Jesus' model of lowly service in the washing of the feet, something we take away for us for our lives, our testimony. And then I just think, you know, John seems so purely and deeply focused on Jesus. You know, his personality and his words and it's just like the spotlight is on him every second of this gospel. And it's just like, if we could just keep our eyes on Jesus, as John has done, we would be blessed. to abide in him more fully. So thank you all. This has been a great series. I've learned so much. I've enjoyed it and great discussion. Really appreciate it. And we will start again January 7th and 8th with Ezekiel. Do we have a closing?
This has been a great series, and I think we've learned so much from it.